Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to, I guess, kind of dive into this picture of what an economy is through this relatively new lens as a non-equilibrium, dynamic system that's constantly changing and evolving. When you speak of economies basically being constituted of knowledge, we could think of technologies as being the embodiments of that knowledge, right? Like that they are our knowledge crystallized in some sense.
So I'll make it more abstract than that. So I've done some work with a colleague of mine called Kurt Dopfer, who's a professor in Switzerland or in Austria now. And we've developed a framework. We call it the meso-macro framework, or we published a book called The General Theory of Economic Evolution. But what we argue is that the core economic unit is the rule, or the generic rule, and it's the analog of a gene. And a rule is just a series of instructions for ordering, matter, energy, and so on, in the same way that a gene is. Some rules will order physical things; those are technologies. Some rules will order people; those are institutions. Some rules will order thinking; that's cognition. Some rules will order the interaction between humans and the world; those are behaviors. And it's not just technologies. Technologies are one aspect of knowledge, but there's lots of other types of knowledge in an economy that are basically performing this function of they're essentially rules. That this turns into a that, or when you have a this, it becomes a that, or this does that, or this combination makes that, and what they are ordering. Whether it's physical things, whether it's social things, whether it's behavioral things, whether it's cognitive things, determines the sort of domain of that. But economic evolution is not just evolution of technologies, it's also evolution of institutions. Markets evolve, firms evolve. It's also evolution of behaviors. We have new habits and routines and preferences. It's also evolution of thinking. We have new models of seeing the world and new behaviors and interactions. And economic evolution is that all of that space co-evolving together. So technologies co-evolve with institutions, co-evolve with business models, co-evolve with behaviors, co-evolve with preferences. And the sum of that, the coordination of all of that together is economic evolution. Now, some of that looks more psychological, some of it looks more sociological and political, some of it is core economics. That's the technologies and preferences thing. But economic evolution is a very broad range of things, because an economy is the sort of infrastructure that organizes all of the humans together with all of the knowledge to create the conditions for life and living and prosperity and wealth and so on.
Yeah,
and
I was thinking
that's what we mean. And then when we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, innovation is change in any of those rule sets. We're used to seeing technological innovation as the main driver. In many ways, it is. It's the one that changes the most and the fastest, and you see it the most. But on a longer time scale, institutional evolution is just as important. On an even longer time scale, behavioral evolution is fundamental.
Do institutions, at least in this framework, I know there's varying definitions around here, but could institutions be seen as social technologies?
Yeah, that's a way.
Yeah. So I know we have social technologies, we have physical technologies, these psychological, the thoughts through which, the thoughts are patterns of thinking. I don't want to categorize those as technologies, because then we could just kind of categorize everything as a technology, right?
All that rationality, I think this is one of the great blind spots in modern economics, is that we've pushed that into an area where we go rational, not rational, leave it to psychology to explain where that comes from. But just a huge amount of creation of value in an economy is coming up with new behaviors, new ways of doing things, new habits and routines. And this is something that a lot of the classical economists saw this very clearly. People like Thorsten Veblen and a lot of the institutional economists really fundamentally saw this role of habits and routines and behaviors and how they differed between groups of people as being fundamental. Now, once you've got an evolutionary understanding of that, we can start to bring culture into the story. And we can start to think about culture as something that is a constraint, an enabler, an enabler of trust, a means of creating coordination and units of organization. So much of the power of an economy, an economy is just a vast system of cooperation. Right? Some of those units of cooperation we call firms, where you've all got the same goal. Some of these units of cooperation we call households, which are things that have the same access to resources. Some of these units of cooperation are nation states, which all have the same governing rule sets, and so on. So, and the forces that hold that together and that lower the transactions cost of that cooperation is just as much part of economics as anything else. So this is one of the points on which I'm quite critical of the way we currently frame economics. Is it's just firms, markets, prices, commodities, et cetera, and just holds everything else constant. I think that's a fundamental category error. Just simply because so much of the explanation of dynamics comes from changes in thinking, behavior, social coordination.
And do you think that myopia is sort of a function of just the blinders that have been put on by the assumptions of neoclassical economics?
Well, I would almost have it the other way around. I think neoclassical economics, along with modern psychology and other fields of study, are just they're just territories that have been marked out that are convenient for education purposes and so on. So the way these schools of these disciplines and subject areas, we tend to think of them as natural categories. Of course, there's economics here and psychology there and sociology there, but they're relatively modern inventions. Those boundaries were way blurrier 100 years ago. And,
natural science back.
Well, yeah.
Natural philosophy, rather, back in the day, yeah.
Political arithmetic and so on. So I like to live in a world where I think I don't respect those boundaries as much as other people do, I think. And I do that not from an iconoclastic perspective. I just don't think it's that useful. I think you end up just treating things as parameters or fixed that aren't actually fixed. And when the core thing you're trying to explain, which is my research program is economic dynamics. How do economies change through time? I need to have a fairly broad conception of change in order to try and do that well. So, I'm far more comfortable rolling in other fields and just treating this all as a evolutionary social science centered around economics, understood as the growth of knowledge.